Welcome once again to the question paper analysis of UGC NET English, December 2021, Shift 1. And this video is offered by Professor Academy, Chennai. And today we are going to discuss question 6 to 10. And let's go to question number 6. Which two of the following conform to Northrop Frye's typology of literature? You have four options here. Before that option, you have four statements. So you have capital A, mythos of spring, which is associated with comedy. Then capital B, mythos of summer, associated with satire. Capital C, mythos of atom, associated with tragedy. D, mythos of winter, associated with romance. Now you have four options. Option A, capital A and B only. So in the sense, spring and summer. So spring equivalent to comedy, summer, satire. Similar way, option B, A and C only. Option C, B and C only. D, B and D only. So let's go to the answer. So what you have to do, you have to choose, something is wrong. Only two are correctly matched. The other two are wrong. You have to find out that. So if you are able to identify at least one, you can eliminate two options and you can narrow down to two other options. And generally, when it comes to literature, think of seasons and it's associated with genre. So the question is based on the one side, you have seasons in a year. On the other side, you have genres in literature. Okay. Let's go to the answer. Answer, option B, A and C only, which is correct. Mythos of spring, comedy. Mythos of atom, tragedy. The other two, they are actually switched. And the question is taken from Northrop Frye's essay collection, Anatomy of Criticism, 4 essays. And this particular question is taken from the third essay, Archetypal Criticism. So under this, Northrop Frye, the Canadian critic, and is also an archetypal critic. And he put forward this theory called theory of mythos. Mythos, it's a kind of a story. And he came up with this 4, associating seasons with genres, literary genres. So generally in literature, when we represent a certain genre, we associate with some seasons. For instance, if you take atom is generally associated with the tragedy, death, and a kind of a sadness. And similar way, so this is how it starts. The mythos of spring is associated with comedy. The mythos of summer is associated with romance. The mythos of atom is associated with tragedy. The mythos of winter is associated with irony and satire. So they may ask, sometimes they may simply go for a direct question. Okay, the mythos of winter is associated with option A, comedy, romance, tragedy, or irony. So that could be a direct question. Or you can also expect questions like who wrote or which critic was known for this essay collection, Anatomy of Criticism. That could be another question. Or they might ask the nationality of this critic. Northrop Frye is a Canadian, right? But there is a twist or a kind of a contradiction when it comes to this association of season and comedy, because in this work, Anatomy of Criticism, particularly under the third essay, Archetypal Criticism, we have this. But in another essay, he actually a slight change in the first top order. For instance, Northrop Frye wrote this essay, The Archetype of Literature, 1951. If you look at this piece of essay, he actually compares not only seasons, he actually compares solar cycle, seasonal cycle, life cycle, and literary genre. If you look at it very carefully, the first one, spring, instead of it is associated with comedy, now it is actually associated with romance. The earlier one, if you go back, spring, comedy, but if we here in this essay, he actually associates spring with romance. Sometimes this is the confusion we have, but the question is direct and it is very specific. They mentioned the word mythos. If you go back to the question, so this question is clear, it's not from that essay. It's actually from this book, Anatomy of Criticism. So we have to go with this set: spring comedy, summer romance, autumn tragedy, winter irony. But if the question is specifically says, okay, according to Northrop Frye, in the essay, the archetypes of literature, the season spring is associated with dash. If it's very specific, then you have to go for this one. But anyway, get to know this. But generally, people go for the earlier one. Spring is generally associated with comedy, but in this essay, it is associated with romance. But let's see. On the one hand, you have solar cycle, dawn, sunrise, then which is equal to spring, which is equal to birth of a hero. Then you have romance. Next, zenith, sun is at its height, noon. Then you have seasonal, summer. Then it's a marriage phase. Then you have comedy. Then we have sunset. It's a kind of a death associated with atom. Then death phase. Then death of a hero. Then it is associated with the genre tragedy. Finally, you have darkness. Then winter, dissolution. It goes everything to dust. Then satire or irony. Right? Sometimes instead of asking seasons and genres, they might ask the solar cycle and life cycle, or life cycle and genre. So you have to pay attention also to this. Sometimes if they want to twist the question, because traditionally they go for season and genre, who knows, next time they go for life cycle and genre or solar cycle and genre. So you have to pay attention to this too. Then Northrop Frye, we know Northrop Frye primarily as a Canadian critic. He was born in Canada. He has written a lot about Canadian literature. On one of his famous book on Canadian literature is The Bush Garden, Essays on the Canadian Imagination, in which Northrop Frye introduced a concept called garrison mentality, Garrison, garrison mentality. According to Frye, this is a kind of a theme that gets repeated often in Canadian poetry. So Canada mostly covered in ice in the northern part. So when they started writing poetry, they then started writing the nature around them. There is a kind of a fear. You can see a sense of fear in their poetry. What is that fear? It's a kind of treating the nature as an enemy. So that kind of a fear, they fear their own surrounding. And Northrop Frye came up with this concept, garrison mentality. What kind of a mentality? Garrison. What is a garrison? Garrison is a group of soldiers posted at a castle, or they have to attack the castle, and at the same time, those who are inside the castle, they have to protect the castle from the enemy. So in this situation, both the soldiers, they are very alert, because anytime anyone can attack. So those who are besieging the castle, those who are going to attack the castle, or those who are safeguarding the castle, both are alert. Similar way, people who live in that landscape, which is known for its terror, terror of ice, they have to be aware of nature itself, which is kind of an inimical to men and women there. So this kind of an attitude, inimical attitude towards nature, is called garrison mentality. So this is how Northrop Frye says, this is the theme which runs throughout Canadian literature, right? And you have another famous critic and also novelist, Margaret Atwood. So Margaret Atwood borrowed this concept from Northrop Frye, and she wrote another book called Survival, which also talk about Canadian literature, right? And with this, let's go to another phase or facet of Northrop Frye. We know Northrop Frye as a Canadian critic. We also know Northrop Frye as an archetypal critic. What is an archetype? Archetype. An archetype refers to something gets repeated again and again in literature. It can be a theme, it can be an image, or a particular character type. So if you talk about this repetition or recurring images or themes, then that study is called, or that feed or criticism is called archetypal criticism. So just we looked at one example, how garrison mentality is a theme that comes again and again in Canadian literature. So that could be one example for you. And the earlier essay we discussed, The Archetype of Literature. That particular essay, published in 1951, also republished in this famous collection, Fables of Identity by Northrop Frye. The subtitle of this book, Studies in Poetic Mythology. And another famous work by Northrop Frye, we have Fearful Symmetry, a study of William Blake. It's in this book, he has taken the poems and other works of William Blake, and he tries to analyze the images and other techniques used by William Blake. It's just a study on William Blake's images. So Fearful Symmetry, and the title was taken from Blake's poem, The Tiger, right? Sometimes this could be a question. Fearful Symmetry by Northrop Frye is a study of which writer, which romantic writer, or the precursor of to romantic writer. So that could be a question. So William Blake could be is the answer. So with this, let's go to the next one. Question number 7. In the essay, Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, Virginia Woolf dash. Virginia, what does she do? In this essay, option A, analyzes the state of modern fiction by contrasting two generations of writers. B, criticizes book buying preferences of the educated English class. C, presents modernity as a stable and coherent project uniting all artists. D, responds to E.M. Foster's remarks on character in fiction. So if you are aware of this essay, it's a very famous essay, often prescribed one. If you are aware of the context or just the gist of the essay, this is a kind of a direct question. Let's go to the answer. Option A. In Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, Virginia Woolf analyzes the state of modern fiction by contrasting two generations of writers. So what is this essay about? This essay was actually a paper presented by Virginia Woolf to a gathering, to a group called the Heretics at Cambridge on 18th May 1924. And later, this paper was titled Character in Fiction, and it was published in T.S. Eliot's journal, The Criterion, which was edited by T.S. Eliot. Then it was renamed. Character in Fiction was renamed Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, and it was published by her own, her press, Virginia Woolf's own press, the Hogarth Press, which was established by Virginia Woolf and her husband, Leonard Woolf, Hogarth Press. And what is this essay about? What is the context? So whenever you read an essay, you should know the context or the historical context or the, what is this, why this essay? You should know the main argument of the essay. So what is the essay about? So earlier, we have this Bennett writer, Arnold Bennett. He actually reviewed Virginia Woolf's novel. And he came to the conclusion, these modern writers cannot create characters that are real. So he made a major accusation against the modernist writers, because after 1900s, modernist writers, we have modern writers after 1900s, especially 1922, the publication of James Joyce's Ulysses, or T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, 1922. So 1922, the year is considered the beginning of modernist age or the modern age in British literature. So Arnold Bennett, in his review, said these modernist writers are unable to create characters that are real. So that's his accusation. So this essay is a defense of modernist writers against Bennett's charge. And this is what he did. It's a kind of a traditionalist view. Arnold Bennett wrote a review on Virginia Woolf's novel, Jacob's Room, which was also published in 1922. And the review was published in Castle's Weekly, March 1923. Then she wrote that paper, she presented that paper, and it was published and finally published as Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown. And what happens? This is the gist of the essay. Virginia Woolf divides writers into two groups. On the one hand, we have the Edwardians, traditionalist writers. We have H.G. Wells, Arnold Bennett, and John Galsworthy. Three writers this side, traditionalist approach. On the other side, we have the Georgians, the modernist writers. We have E.M. Foster, D.H. Lawrence, Lytton Strachey, biographer, James Joyce, and T.S. Eliot. So this is the main argument. She divides writers into two groups, traditionalist and modernist. Now she has a task for these writers. So this essay or this speech is a kind of a story. She invents character. So what happens? Virginia Woolf says she comes up with a kind of a story. So what happens? One day, an anonymous traveler, and she names the traveler Mrs. Brown, an old woman, age 60. She was traveling from Richmond to Waterloo, and she is actually vexed. Why? She has been arguing over something with a man, and let's name the man. The man is Mr. Smith, age 40. Even this could be a question. The characters Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Smith were created by Virginia Woolf in which essay or which work? So even this can be a question. So what happens now? Virginia Woolf gets on the train, and when she enters the train, she sees two people, Mrs. Brown and Mr. Smith. They have been arguing over something, and now because of her presence, they stopped arguing. And it seems there's a kind of a bargain, a hard bargain, after which Mr. Smith gets off the train at the station, Clapham Junction. Now we are left with Mrs. Brown, an old woman. And Virginia Woolf says, now I have a task for these writers. We have two sets of writers. We have traditionalists on the one hand, Edwardians and the modernists. So what is the task for these writers? One, they have to supposedly a realistic portrayal of Mrs. Brown. So they have to come up with, they have to portray Mrs. Brown. They try to capture the essence or the soul of Mrs. Brown before she gets down at her station, Waterloo. So this is the task. The train is moving and the task begins. So first we have Edwardians and Georgian. But ultimately what happens? The Edwardians couldn't capture, they couldn't go into the mind of Mrs. Brown. Instead, what they do, they simply talk about her dress, or they talk about the train, or they talk about something outside the train of creating a utopia like H.G. Wells. So they just could capture only the fabric of things, only the outer reality, not the inner reality. So this is the difference between traditionalists and modernists. Traditionalists, they try to capture outer reality, whereas the Georgians or modernist writers, they try to capture the inner reality of characters, how they think about the world, their perception about the external world. So that's how we get this technique, stream of consciousness. What goes on? It's a stream of consciousness, simply put, flow of thoughts in a character's mind at a given point of time. So these writers, the modernists, the Georgians, try to capture that, her inner reality, the inner reality of Mrs. Brown. They might have failed initially, but at least they tried. So that's the conclusion we arrive at. And finally, Virginia Woolf says, she ends the essay with this: the traditionalists went for conventional. They had certain conventions to represent reality. But in the modern age, industrial age, we should go beyond certain conventions. We have to break those conventions and come up with new tools to capture the inner reality of characters. And at least the Georgians gave a good try. So she concludes, the tools of one generation are useless to the next generation. And the capture of Mrs. Brown, capture in the sense how they are going to capture the soul, like Russian writers of Mrs. Brown, is the title of the next chapter in the history of literature. So we can consider this essay as a kind of a defense of modernist writers, and also a kind of a manifesto of modern literature in Britain. Okay. So with this, let's go to the next question. Question number 8. Who among the following compared the mind in creation to a fading coal? Coleridge, option A; B, Keats; C, Shelley; D, Wordsworth. It's a bit tough question. Even if you have read Coleridge Biographia Literaria, or Keats' essay, or Shelley's essay, or Wordsworth the preface, it is tough, because the question is taken from somewhere, some line in an essay by these romantic writers, and they have given this. But let's check out the answer. and we have to be careful next time when we read such essays. So answer C, Shelley. The question is taken from Shelley's A Defense of Poetry. So this is the exact line. Shelley says, the greatest poet even cannot say it, certain things. For the mind in creation is as a fading coal. So here we have a simile. The mind in creation is compared to a fading coal, a live coal which is fading, kind of an ember which is hot, which some invisible influence, like an inconstant wind, awakens to transitory brightness. Sometimes we get air and the coal becomes alive, but not fully alive. This power arises from within, like the color of a flower, which fades and changes as it is developed. And the conscious portions of our natures are unprophetic either of its approach or its departure. So simply put, if you want to be a writer, it should come from within. External factor may not, provoke you to write something fantastic. If you really want to come up with something, a creative one, a piece, it should come from within. The inspiration comes from within. So that's what Shelley says in this work. But it's a tough, because the question is tough in the sense it's some line in this essay. There are also famous lines in this essay, but the question setters went for this kind of a comparison. So next time when we study essays like this, A Defense of Poetry, we have to pay attention to comparisons, or is there a say, that's how they set questions. So you have to think like a question setter. In this passage, what can be asked as a question except the fading coal? So whenever you read essays, if you have a metaphor or an image or some reference to characters or writers, then that could be a possible question. So you have to take down notes or underline and read that point. Okay. But let's also check out some of the famous lines from this essay, A Defense of Poetry, which is generally studied along with Sidney's defense, Apology for Poetry. Apology means defense. Shelley also borrows certain points from Sidney's Apology. So these are the famous lines, some of the famous lines from this essay, Shelley's essay. Shelley says, poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar. So it's actually a definition or an understanding of how literature works. What is literature or what is poetry? Its function is to make the familiar objects unfamiliar. So it's like watching a movie. Why do we watch a movie? Because we, if they try to, project, or they try to show only what we see every day, then we won't go to a theater to watch that. Because when we go there, yes, we know certain things, every day, but in the movie, it is projected in a different way. Familiar objects are made into something else, kind of unfamiliar one. We get that feeling. That's why we enjoy watching movies. Similar way, the function of literature is to defamiliarize, familiar objects. So this concept was first put forward by Shelley, but this concept was also put forward later by another critic who went for a term called defamiliarization, right? Russian formalist called Viktor Slavsky. So if you are interested, why don't you check out? Sometimes when we read, we have to go for comparisons. So on the one hand, you have Shelley making the statement. On the other side, you have a critic, Viktor Slavsky, Russian formalist, making a statement. Both are similar. So if you have similar points, you can actually easily remember, right? So Viktor Slavsky's term, critical term, defamiliarization, is already there. Shelley anticipates such a term in this essay. Next, Shelley also says, of all Shakespeare's plays, King Lear is the most perfect specimen of the dramatic art existing in the world. Of all the tragedies, this is considered the best by Shelley. So maybe next time, this might be a question. That's what I told you. Whenever there is something, there is a mention of a work or a writer or kind of a metaphor, image, simile, then you have to pay attention. So this could be a question. According to Shelley, which play of Shakespeare is the most perfect specimen of the dramatic art existing in the world? So if you have underlined this one or paid attention to this one, you could have easily answered that question, right? Similarly, we have another statement, Milton by Shelley. Shelley said, Milton stood alone, eliminating an age unworthy of him. So this could be a question. Who said Milton stood alone, eliminating an age unworthy of him? Then another statement, he compares Milton with the other epic writers. So he makes this statement, Homer was the first epic writer and Dante the second epic poet. Milton was the third epic poet. So this could be a question. What is the position given to Milton, the third epic poet, or they could go for second epic poet? See, generally we go for Homer, then Virgil, but this time we have Dante, right? So that could be a twist. And the final line of this essay is the most quoted line from Shelley's work. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. They make rules, they make laws for a perfect society. Okay. Now let's go to the next question. Question number 9. What was poor Yorick in Hamlet? The question is from Shakespeare's Hamlet. And this question is a bit easy, but also tricky. So option A, actor, B, gravedigger, C, jester, D, soldier. So if you know the context of Hamlet, then this is a straightforward question. But the thing is, when you prepare for NET exam, you should be aware of at least some 10 plays of Shakespeare. At least you should know the context, the characters, or the lines, the famous lines from at least 10 plays of Shakespeare. Definitely we get a question from Shakespeare. And the answer to this question, C, jester. Who is a jester? Jester is a kind of comedian at a king's court. It's like a Tenali Raman or Birbal. So we have a jester, one who is known for his witty comments and remarks, all right, and who also entertains through wit. And this is why this question, you have to ask yourself, why? Because we have this famous scene in Hamlet. You know, Hamlet holds a skull and he speaks to that skull, right? The skull is actually Yorick's skull. And what is the context? What happens now? Ophelia, the heroine of Hamlet, the play, is dead and she is going to be buried. And we have clowns, gravediggers. They are the clowns. They are actually digging the grave. And Hamlet has escaped from going to England, and he comes back to Denmark, and with his friend Horatio, and he goes to the graveyard. He looks at the grave diggers, and they actually dig out a skull, and this is the skull. And the grave digger says this belongs to the King Hamlet's jester who died years ago. And this is the context. And there is another interesting thing about this situation or this scene in Hamlet. Why? Because in this, we come to know the age of Hamlet. How old is Hamlet? We get this answer because of this context. Hamlet actually asked this question to the clown. How long have you been grave maker? So simply, how long have you been doing this job as a grave digger? Then clown answers, of all the days in the year, I came to that day that our last King Hamlet overcame Fortinbras. Now, the clown is actually referring to a context. King Hamlet, the father of Prince Hamlet, actually defeated King Fortinbras of Norway. On that particular day, when Denmark defeated Norway, this clown or gravedigger came to this profession. So that is one. Then Hamlet asks, how long is that since? Clown says, can't you tell that? Everyone knows. And here is a pun. Every fool, because clown is actually a fool. Every fool can tell that. It was the very day that young Hamlet was born. So now if you know the years, how long this clown has been working as a gravedigger, we can also find out the age of Hamlet. And the clown actually answered this. The clown says, I have been sexton here, man and boy, 30 years. So he has been working as a gravedigger for 30 years. And from this statement, we come to the conclusion that Hamlet is actually 30 years old, not a kind of a middle-age crisis, going through middle-age crisis. And this kind of a technique is called a syllogism. They give you two statements and you put it in such a way, you infer certain things out of it. You come to a conclusion. So this is the conclusion we get out of this scene. So that's why this scene is very important. So whenever you read a play, focus on scenes, importantly scenes like soliloquy, to be or not to be, or the end, what happens, some of the characters, some of the famous dialogues. So this, if you are aware of all these things, at least you can eliminate options. For instance, if you know the context, definitely Yorick is not a gravedigger or a soldier or an actor. All right. Next, we'll go to the final question of today's class. Which of the following poems contains John Donne's famous conceit, metaphysical conceit, bringing a parallel between lovers and the hands of a compass? It's very easy because this is a kind of A-level question, very easy question. Because if you have read John Donne, you know this comparison, right? Option A valediction forbidding mourning. B, a valediction of weeping. C, lovers' infiniteness. D, negative love. We'll straight away go to the answer. A valediction forbidding mourning. So in this poem, we have this metaphysical conceit. What is a conceit? Conceit is a comparison between two dissimilar objects. So what is the comparison here? A pair of lovers are compared to a pair of compass. I mean, the legs of compass. They function like that. Look at the lines. If they be two, they are two so, as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul, the fixed foot. So here we have, this is a description of the compass, which has two legs. One leg is at the center, and it actually completes a circle. So we need both the legs to act in union to come up with this circle of life. Similar way, if the marriage or the relationship should be a successful one, they should be of one mind. So that is the comparison, right? Thy soul, so their soul is like the fixed foot, makes no show to move, but doth if the other do. So if someone makes a move, it also moves. And there is this circle of life or circle of love, right? And once you know this, why don't you check out the other metaphysical conceits and the famous statement? We have Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson, in his The Life of Cowley, he made this famous statement about metaphysical conceit. What is metaphysical conceit? Two dissimilar objects are compared beautifully. It's a kind of unification of thought and feeling, right? So Dr. Johnson says, but he said it in a negative way. It's not a compliment, by the way. Johnson said, metaphysical conceit is actually a combination of dissimilar images, but the most heterogeneous ideas, heterogeneous, they vary, they are not the same, are yoked by violence together, forcefully. These images, a pair of lovers being compared with, legs of a compass. So it's a kind of a forceful one, right? It's a kind of a, not a natural combination or a natural comparison. So he calls this comparison a kind of a violent one, right? So the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. Now you can also go and check out the members of Metaphysical School of Poetry and also Elizabethan Age, right? So with this, let's finish today's class. Tomorrow, let's discuss another file in depth. Thank you so much for attending. So you can also check out Professor Academy, and you can also contact Professor Academy in this website link. Also, this number 75501 00920. Thank you so much. See you tomorrow.